All right, good morning, everybody. Still morning, right? Could take our seats, please. Welcome to our first DEP topical presentation. I'm Mark Petruca. I'll be your moderator for this morning. DEP presentations are 30-minute programs designed to provide guidance from DEP on a variety of topics. The DEP representatives are appearing virtually, and as part of each session, we'll provide a brief presentation with time allotted in the session for topical questions from the audience. Please do not ask site-specific questions. These sessions will end promptly every half hour. If we are unable to get to a specific question, please submit that question directly to the presenter's email addresses. And as you'll see on the tables here, there's a QR code that you can use to open up a form through which you can submit your questions in writing. So our first session is on pre-purchase administrative consent orders. Ann Wolf, Jackie Bobko, and Erica Najjar will discuss pre-purchase administrative consent orders. Specifically, they will touch on what pre-purchase administrative consent orders are and eligibility requirements, timing and how to request one, adjustments made to direct oversight requirements, pre-purchaser ACOs and ISRA, and the pre-purchaser ACO certification form. Some brief bios on our presenters. Ann Wolf is the Chief of Site Remediation's Bureau of Enforcement and Investigations. Some of her prior roles include case manager and supervisor in the ISRA program, project manager and supervisor in the Blue Acres program, procurement and contract supervisor for site remediation, and procurement specialist for Department of Treasury. Jackie Bobko is a supervisor from the Bureau of Enforcement and Investigation who focuses on pre-purchase ACOs. Prior to working in BEI, she was a case manager in the ISRA program. And Erica Najjar is an enforcement manager in the Bureau of Enforcement and Investigations. She specializes in pre-purchase ACOs and assists the RFS unit with remediation funding source cases that are out of compliance. So we'll turn it over to Ann. And again, if you have questions, please use the QR code. Submit questions using the form. All set, Ann?
Yes, thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. We hope that you are having a great conference, and we are happy to be here today and share some information about pre-purchase ACOs. Our contact information is on this slide, and it will also appear again later. Next slide. This is a slide of some of the acronyms that we may use during the presentation. So I thought I would just give you a moment if anyone is not familiar with these and you want to take a quick picture, you are welcome to do so. So I'll just give you a moment to do that. And while you're doing that, we have been doing pre-purchase ACOs since about 2017, and in the first few years, initially just doing a handful each year. As of today, we've done about 75 of them, so they are becoming more popular, and we are getting more frequent requests than we got back in 2017. Next slide. We have a guidance document and we have a certification form, and those both will be uploaded to the SRP webpage in the very near future. Next slide. If you need those documents prior to them being uploaded to the website, you are welcome to contact us for those documents directly. So what is a pre-purchase ACO? A pre-purchase ACO is for parties who are under contract to purchase a site that is subject to direct oversight. In addition to an actual contract to purchase, It could also be acquisition through foreclosure, sheriff sale, things along those lines. The pre-purchase ACO allows certain adjustments to direct oversight. New compliance timeframes are given to the buyer to complete the remediation. Without the benefits of a pre-purchase ACO, the buyer will have to comply with all of the direct oversight requirements. Next slide. So for a site where a discharge was discovered prior to May 7th of 1999, the Site Remediation Reform Act established a statutory time frame for completion of the remedial investigation. And that time frame is May 7th, 2014, or for certain extension provisions, May 7th of 2016. In addition to that, SARA authorized the department to establish mandatory and expedited site-specific timeframes for certain aspects and phases of the remediation, which you can see listed on the screen. Next slide. So the timeframes that are established for the site are specific to the site. They do not run with the person who is responsible for conducting the remediation. So therefore, if there is a change in parties conducting the remediation, the timeframes do not change. The timeframes apply to the site. Okay, next slide. If a statutory, mandatory, or expedited site-specific timeframe is missed, then the site is subject to compulsory direct oversight by the department. Next slide. The Site Remediation Reform Act and ARCs include provisions that allow the department to make adjustments to certain direct oversight requirements. So the pre-purchase ACO will give some adjustments to those requirements. Next slide. Oops. Okay. So once a buyer of a site acquires title to a contaminated property, the buyer becomes a person in any way responsible for remediation under the Spill Act. DEP will execute an ACO prior to purchase with a buyer. And again, that ACO allows for adjustments to direct oversight. Without the benefits of the pre-purchase ACO, then the buyer will have to comply with all of the direct oversight requirements. Next slide. Also very, very important. The pre-purchase ACO must be fully executed, meaning executed by the party and by the department. Both parties or all parties have to sign prior to the buyer acquiring the property. Unlike other ACOs, the pre-purchase ACO becomes effective at closing. So all parties have to sign it. They then have that document for the closing or the auction or the foreclosure or whatever method they're using for acquisition. And then once that acquisition occurs, that is the effective date of the ACO. Next slide, please. Okay, and at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Jackie. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I will start out with eligibility for a pre-purchase ACO. So the site must be in direct oversight. Cases that are not in direct oversight cannot receive a pre-purchase ACO. So the site has to have missed statutory, mandatory, or expedited site-specific timeframe. Also, the buyer cannot be a discharger of a hazardous substance at the contaminated site or in any way responsible for a hazardous substance at the site. The buyer must not currently own or ever owned the site or be an operator at the site. And lastly, they cannot be a predecessor, successor, etc. Next slide, please. Adjustments made to direct oversight. So the first adjustment is any type of RFS mechanism can be used. That would include letter of credit, line of credit, remediation trust fund, or surety bond. The only thing that's not allowed is self-guarantee. The 1% RFS annual surcharge is waived. However, this does not apply to ISRA sites. There is no case manager assigned, so the remediation can proceed without department approval. Annual remediation fees are paid in lieu of oversight costs. The only time that oversight costs would be assessed if there's an IEC involved at the site. Submittals will continue to go through the inspection review process. Feasibility study is not required. The buyer would then choose the remedy and no public notice would be required. Next slide, please. Next, I'll be discussing adjustments direct oversight requirements that are not adjusted. Of course, an LSRP must be retained and maintained. All known contaminated areas of concern must be addressed. Anything that has migrated off-site included. A remediation cost review form must be submitted and RFS established. And new timeframes would be established in the ACO for documents such as the Remedial Investigation Report, Remedial Action Report, or other documents that are out of compliance and need to be submitted. Next slide, please. So industrial establishments under ISRA. These ACOs tend to be more complex. One issue that we ask is to make sure that there are no ISRA triggers where filings were not made in the past. This happens often and can substantially delay the process in drafting the ACO, since these ISRA triggers will need to be addressed and forms submitted. And lastly here, each industrial establishment at a site must obtain an RAO based on a site preliminary assessment site investigation. Next slide, please. Industrial establishments under ISRA. New GINs or amended GINs must be submitted as soon as possible, since this information is included in the pre-purchase ACO. A GIN must be submitted for the sale of property. So if, for example, there was a cessation of operations, a amended GIN would be submitted in that case for the sale. And any other, like I mentioned before, any other ISRA triggers that were unaccounted for also have to be, GINs have to be submitted for those as well. So with an ISRA site, prior to closing, the buyer needs to submit an ISRA remediation certification form with sections F and G signed. With the remediation certification comes the cost review form, the remediation cost review and RFS FA form. The establishment of the RFS has to take place before with the submittal of the remediation certification. The 1% annual RFS surcharge will be needed, and annually thereafter, and the site contact information update form will be submitted. Now, just as a side note, if the site is just subject to the Spill Act, not ISRA, these four items, the cost review, the RFS, the 1%, and the SCUF, can be submitted 30 days after closing. Next slide, please. Due diligence. So we can't say enough about due diligence. The buyer should contact the department after doing appropriate inquiry when they request the pre-purchase ACO. What we mean by appropriate inquiry could be a PASI. A PASI enables the buyer to know, what contamination is out there, what type of contamination that's potentially unknown, the cost, and what ultimately the buyer will be responsible for. Also, you could conduct an OPRA review and use the DEP data miner. Next slide, please. If the buyer meets the 3 requirements that I started my discussion with, which were not that the person interested in purchasing the site is not a discharger, a person in any way responsible for hazardous substance at the site, it doesn't own the site or was never an operator at the site, and is not a predecessor. So they will submit the certification form certifying those 3 conditions. But we do request a letter to the department, sent to the department. It can be emailed, requesting the ACO along with that certification form. And we request that at a minimum, we have a 2-month lead time to craft the ACO. Some ACOs may take longer, like I mentioned, if it's an ISRA case, if other bureaus are involved, such as RECRA, and it depends on the complexity of the case. Some ACOs may take us less time. Next slide, please. So along with the cover letter requesting the pre-purchase ACO, we would also need the current deed and a copy of the purchase and sale agreement. The purchase price can be redacted if that's an issue. Another issue that holds up the site, holds up the drafting of the ACO is oftentimes the necessary information such as the site address, blocks and lots do not match in all the documents submitted. So for example, many times we get a pre-purchase ACO request letter that the address is different than on the contract of sale or the blocks and lots, as well as the entities that are actually buying the site. So we just ask that everything is consistent. Next slide, please. So along with the request letter, the deed and the contract, we also expect that the pre-purchase ACO certification form be submitted for all entities involved. So the parent company, the holding companies, or if there's an assignment of rights, each entity needs to make their own certifications. And again, if this is not done and we have to go back and ask for it, it does take up time. Next slide, please. So the other scenarios of possible transactions that Ann touched on are sheriff's sale, municipal tax sale certificate, and bankruptcy. If you have one of these scenarios, if you could please contact the department so we can understand the unique circumstances involved with these transactions, that would help us to better enable to make sure that your timeframes are met. And with that, I will hand the presentation over to Erica.
Thank you, Jackie. Hi, everyone. So on this slide, we have a screenshot of our certification form. So as Jackie previously mentioned, this form should be submitted with the cover letter. There should only be one entity filling out a form. So in section B, we have the prospective purchaser filling out that section. They'll sign the form. And if they have any related entities, such as a parent company, holding company, assigner, etc., they'll fill out section C on their own form and then sign. So we really only have one signature line per form, so one entity per form. And in section B, the purchaser filling out that section should match the entity on the contract of sale. If they don't match, an assignment of rights is needed. Otherwise, the entity on the contract of sale will have to sign the ACO, so both sections should match. And then if you have submitted one of these forms before on behalf of a client, please just note that we did change the form a little bit due to feedback that we received. So this version will be uploaded to the web, so just be sure that you're using the most recent version, and you can always ask us for the version as well. Next slide, please. So this slide is showing an example of related entities. So these related entities would sign section C on the form that was on the previous slide. So in this scenario, Party LLC is the entity on the contract of sale, and they did not want to sign the ACO, so they assigned all of their rights to Party 1 LLC, who will be signing the ACO. And Party 1 LLC has multiple members above them. So again, all those members would have to fill out their own form and sign for section C. Next slide, please. And then this is just an example of the signatory block for the entities that were on the previous slide. So again, Party 1 LLC is signing, and all of their members are listed below. And John Smith, in this case, signed the ACO as the authorized signatory. And we typically don't accept this title unless a letter is submitted from the owners of the entity at the top of the chain, and they basically give authorization for John Smith to sign on behalf of the entity signing the ACO. So either the owners have to sign the ACO, or they have to submit a letter giving authority to someone else to sign. And if you want to give us an example of the ACO signatory block, that could help quicken the process up. It does take a little bit to figure out how everyone's related, and it could just take time. So it's not required, but it could help us a little bit. Next slide, please. Violations, liens, and judgments. So the current property owner or operator could have outstanding monies that doesn't have a lien yet. It could have a Spill Act lien with the department on the site, or there could be other liens like a municipal property lien out there. So just be sure to do your due diligence. For Spill Act liens that are with the department, those would have to be paid within 30 days after closing. And that does have to be paid by the buyer if the seller does not pay that. We don't get involved in any third-party agreements, so that language will remain in the ACO unless it's settled before the ACO is executed. And then in the cover letter that's submitted with the form, if you could just identify any outstanding enforcement actions that could be in other program areas, such as water quality, land use, solid waste. If they have any violations or penalties that are out there, we ask that you just put this in the letter, and this will be outlined in the ACO, just stating that those violations are out there. Next slide, please. In that cover letter, we ask that you also just give us the remediation objective. So if the site is not subject to ISRA, just confirm if an REOE is being obtained, and if not, just let us know what will be obtained for the site. And then any missing items from the cover letter or anything that was wrong in the form will just delay the process. So if you could include all that to begin with, that would be great. Next slide, please. What happens if the ACO signatory doesn't comply? Full direct oversight will be reinstated. The owner could be subject to penalties unless they are exempt from the Spill Act. And then if there's non-compliance, the department can draw down on the RFS and use that money for future remediation at the site. Next slide, please. After closing, the buyer will email the enforcement manager the date that the closing occurred, and this will start the clock for the time frames. And as Ann mentioned, this is the effective date that's outlined in the ACO. So within 30 days after that closing date, SCUF will have to be submitted, LSRP will have to be retained, and then these next two items are for Spill Act cases only. So a cost estimate will have to be submitted to the enforcement manager. That will have to be a certified version. That could be emailed, and then once the enforcement manager approves that, then the RFS can be established, and that will have to be submitted as a hard copy to BCANE, and that address is on the bottom of the RFS form. And then lastly, any annual remediation fees will have to be paid within 30 days. So again, the buyer will have to pay these if the seller does not, and that language will remain in the ACO if it's not paid before the ACO is executed. So sometimes people ask if that language can be taken out if the seller is paying at closing, but we can't remove that until it's paid. Next slide, please. And with that, we will open the floor to any questions.
All right, thanks, Anne, Jackie, and Erica.
Next session, remediation timeframes. Rafael Rivera will discuss regulatory and mandatory remediation timeframes, how COVID-related executive orders may impact timeframes, how to view timeframes in DEP data miner, and the uses of remedial timeframe notification form. Rafael is a section chief in the Bureau of Case Assignment and Initial Notice and has been with the department for 30+ years. Rafael, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rafael. I will be highlighting some tools available on SRP's website, the EO 103 extensions, and going over the remedial timeframe notification form. Next slide. So as Anne mentioned before in her presentation, the Site Remediation Reform Act required the department to establish mandatory timeframe for key phases of remediation, such as the PASI, RI, RA. So to keep RPs on track, the department also established regulatory timeframes to avoid missing mandatory timeframes, which result in direct oversight. Next slide. A summary of the regulatory and mandatory timeframes can be found on the SRP's website under Quick Reference Guide. It's my understanding that SRP is currently working on the document and should be updated soon. Next slide. A summary of the Executive Order 103 regulatory compliance issues can be found by selecting the EO 103 link on the main SRP website. The majority of EO extensions have been applied. However, there's still a small universe of cases that have not been updated. We are currently working on identifying that universe and updating them. Next slide. So the link provides information pertaining to the EO 103 impacts on ACOs, site investigations for regulated US, soil-only cases, and a summary of the 3 notices of rule waivers and listservs associated with them. EO 103 applied to certain timeframes due between March 9th, 2020 and January 11, 2022, outlined in the notices. A summary of the extensions are as follows. For statutory cases, a 1-year RA extension was granted if an LSRP was retained. For non-statutory cases, 455 days was granted if an LSRP was retained. It also extended subsequent timeframes. Now, for cases that did not meet the February 1st, 2021 notice requirement, and timeframes were due between March 9th, 2020 and January 31st, 2021, 270 days were granted. For this universe, subsequent timeframes were not extended. So that's a quick summary of the 103. Next slide. So to determine the timeframes associated with a case or LSR activity, you must use the case tracking tool report found on Data Miner. A Data Miner link is provided on SRP's main page. Next slide. Data Miner gives you the option to search by either site or category. If you search by category, which is my preference, then select the site remediation from the drop-down and scroll down to the case tracking tool report by PI number. So if you do that, next slide. The report summarizes the key phase documents with corresponding due dates under the schedule section of the report. This example depicts a case that received a 2-year RI statutory extension to 5/7/2016. The original RAR due date was 5/6/21, received a 1-year extension per EO, which made the RA due 5/6/2022. We will cover the requirements for extensions later in the presentation. Next slide. So to determine if the EO 103 extension was applied to the case, you can use the data miner site search report, which is a different report than the case tracking report. Once you locate the report, you will have to identify the case, LSR activity, and drill down to activity tracking and search for the task EO 103 extension apply. These are some of the tools you can use to determine the timeframes associated with the case. I will now go over the remedial timeframe notification form. Next. So the remedial timeframe notification form must be submitted for all extension, lengthening, and media updates. Only check off the boxes that apply and complete correspondence section. One form for each LSR or case. There's no need to reflect the new dates in section C of the form when completing the lengthening section, section E. What happens is it creates confusion for us because we're not sure if you're doing lengthening or an extension or doing both. And sometimes people put different dates, so it does get a little tricky. Please reserve section C for extensions only. Please exhaust all media lengthening options if they apply to the site before applying for an extension. Also, make sure you check data miner to ensure dates are correct before submitting your remedial timeframe notification form. If the dates are incorrect, please contact BCANE before submitting the form at srwm_ngems@dep.nj.gov. And also as a note, because I still get emails about this, indicating that they submitted the annual remediation fee form to document groundwater contamination, and they're wondering why the timeframes haven't been updated. The ARF submission does not update the timeframes. You still have to submit the form. That was a listserv that went out September 27, 2017. The link is provided on the slides. Next slide. So all regulatory extension requests must be submitted at least 30 days prior to the regulatory timeframe, but no sooner than 6 months. Complete section C of the form with the justification. The justification must specify why the timeframes will not be met and steps taken to minimize the delay. The regulatory extension request cannot exceed the mandatory timeframe. So for an example, if a PA is due 6/15/22, which represents the regulatory timeframe, then the extension should not exceed 1 year, 6/15/23, which represents the mandatory timeframe. You will have the ability to apply for a mandatory extension at least 60 days prior to 6/15/23. And as a note, all regulatory extensions are deemed approved as noted on the form unless you receive a denial letter. Next slide. Extension requests for mandatory timeframes must be submitted at least 60 days prior to the mandatory timeframe, but no sooner than 6 months. Extension requests in certain circumstances, excuse me, are deemed approved, I'm sorry, approved such as permits and funding. However, the submittal must be technically and administratively complete. The extension shall be equal to the actual duration of the delay. If you're submitting an extension request because you're waiting for a permit prior to issuing the REO, please request 6 months. The approval letter will reference that it's conditionally approved and will be equal to the amount of time it takes the department to issue the permit or funding. The case tracking tool report will be updated after the issuance of the permit with the new due dates. However, if the permit grant application is deemed technically or administratively deficient, it may result in revocation of the extension. Sorry about that. All MTF extension requests will receive either an approved or denial letter. Next slide. So in summary, these are some of the most common reasons extensions get denied. One is extensions are not received within the specified timeframe, 30 days for regulatory or 60 days for mandatory. A previously missed timeframe may result in denial, and inadequate justification. 1 and 2 are very clear, but I will provide you an example for number 3. Next slide. So this is an example of an inadequate justification. The justification does not provide any details. It references typical issues encountered while attempting to gain access, difficulties of conducting remedial work during COVID-19 pandemic. The justification did not elaborate on whether the PRCR LSRP sent out certified letters as per ARCs. They did not reference if they have initiated any court action to obtain access. They did not elaborate on what difficulties were encountered during COVID. You have to realize that the department already gave everyone an additional year for statutory cases or 455 days for non-statutory to account for COVID. So we need to provide some specific details, what issues were encountered. Next slide. So, I know everybody wanted an example during some of the LSRPA meetings I've attended, and, as a result of all the extension requests we received, I was able to at least take a snapshot of a couple. So this is an example of inadequate justification. In a bulleted format, the justification gives brief history of the remediation and timeline of activities conducted at the site. Next slide. The justification also provided a schedule with future activities and anticipated submission dates. And again, this was not the entire justification, but it kind of gives you an idea of what we're looking for and what makes it easier for us. And I'll get into that later why. Next slide. So to determine the status of your extension request, see the data miner site search report under activity tracking, which is the same report I referenced earlier in the presentation for the EO extension apply task. If it has a completed date, the request has been processed. If it's blank, then it's still pending but was received. So that's one way you can tell whether we have your extension request, but it's still pending. Look for the task, and if it has a completed date, that means it was processed. And the new date should be reflected on the case tracking tool. Next slide. So I added this slide to the presentation to give an overview of the extension request we received prior to the May 6, 2022 deadline. As I mentioned earlier, the reason the bulleted format helps because we got over 1,700 extensions were received during the period between 11/1/21 and May 6, 2022. The 1,700 were mostly related to the 3 universes identified on the chart. We approved over 800 for regulatory, approved over 600 for mandatory, denied 175 for regulatory, denied over 84 for mandatory, issued 85 conditional approvals, which were related to remedial action permits. We were able to process all mandatory timeframe extension requests before the 5/6/2022 deadline. So that's an overview of the extensions. And now I will go over a little bit about lengthening. Next slide. So lengthening only applies to the remedial investigation phase for non-statutory cases if the conditions under number 5 exist at the site. Section E2 corresponds to how many boxes are checked off under 5. Lengthening media will change the RI and RA regulatory mandatory timeframes. So please make sure you exhaust all your lengthening options before submitting an extension request. No ISRA cases can only select the first 3 boxes if the conditions outlined apply to the site. And the reason I mention that is because a lot of times, they check off, for example, 1 box on number 5. However, when they get to number 2, it says number of years. They see maximum of 4 years. They figure, hey, I can put 3, 4 years in there. But that's supposed to correspond to how many boxes you check off on number 5. And that then the dates are all, we're trying to figure out what's the right date or what are they trying to do. So that's one of the issues. I just want to point that out. Next slide. So that's a quick look at some of the tools available and some of the key points about completing the remedial timeframe notification form. This slide gives you some contact information should you have any questions. Mostly, I'll go real quick here. So for general questions, extension, lengthening, media, data miner concerns, you can contact the BCAIM duty officer at 609-292-2943. If there's data errors only, those should be sent to srwm_ngems@dep.nj.gov. As far as consequences of missed direct oversight requirements, which is also any denials to extension requests, you should be contacting compliance assistance duty officer at 609-633-1480. And just as a note, I think most people know this already, but just in case, submit all remedial timeframe notifications via email to srpsubmissions@dep.nj.gov. Paper copies will not be required unless requested by the department. Next slide. So if you have any specific issues or regarding a site, you can email me. That's my email, rafael.rivera@dep.nj.gov. So that kind of concludes my presentation. This way it'll give you time to ask any questions if you have any. Unfortunately, this wasn't done back in February, which probably would have helped since most people were looking for additional guidance before the deadline. But you know, hopefully this will be helpful for any future extension requests that are submitted.
All right, everybody, if we could all take our seats and get ready to start our third session here. Okay, our last session this morning is on financial assurance. Mike Infinger will discuss financial assurance options and model documents, as well as some common pitfalls. Mike is a unit supervisor in the Bureau of Remedial Action Permitting. He also acts as the financial assurance coordinator for the program. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Hi, yes, I'm Mike Infanger with Bureau of Remedial Action Permitting, and I'd like to talk today a little bit about financial assurance. Next slide. Okay, financial assurance was established by the Site Remediation Reform Act. This act established a permitting program to regulate the operation, maintenance, and inspection of engineering controls and institutional controls. NJSA 58:10C-19 establishes financial assurance. If you have an engineering control, you need to post financial assurance unless all permittees are exempt. And please note that, note this citation. All financial assurance documents will have this citation in them. Next slide. Okay, let's go through the financial assurance exemptions. One exemption is if you're a government entity, okay, and this would be a municipality. It would be some sort of agency, including quasi-governmental agencies like the Turnpike, the Parkway, and also a public university would be considered a government entity. We have what's called the innocent purchaser exemption, and that means the party is innocent. That is, they did not contribute to the discharge, and they purchased the property before May 2009, which is when the Site Remediation Reform Act was enacted. Another exemption would be a childcare or a school, and school is defined as K through 12. Also, if it's a primary or secondary residence, and also if it's a small business who is remediating a site at which they operate and that they own. And I put this in bold letters, and I've been asked, well, when would this ever come to play? And a couple of examples would be, suppose you have a permit, you have a small business exemption, but then you sell the property. Well, you no longer own the property, so the small business exemption would not apply to you. You would have to either post the financial assurance or make arrangements for someone else to post it. Another possible example would be if you need a notice in lieu of deed notice. So you need a permit for the offsite roadway or such. Again, you might be a small business and you might have a permit and have a small business exemption for your permit, but the offsite property is owned by the municipality or whoever. And so you would not own that property and you would not have an exemption for that. Next slide. Yeah, let's go through the types of mechanisms that are available for you to post financial assurance. One type is a remediation trust fund, and this is cash held by a trustee. It's cash held in escrow, into which the department can draw on. A line of credit, which is an open line of cash available, usually using the property itself, the equity in the property as the collateral. A letter of credit, which is a promise of cash to a beneficiary, which would be the department. An environmental insurance policy, which is a claims-based available funds to the department. In other words, the department has to be able to draw and make a claim on the insurance policy, and also a surety bond. Now, surety bonds are not presently in the ARC's rule, but we are allowing their use before the ARC's rule readoption. Next slide. Okay, to estimate the financial assurance amount, you need to calculate the cost of maintaining the engineering control, including maintenance, inspection of the cap, or engineering control, could be a fence or something. You might have an engineering control for groundwater, such as a pump and treat system. So here you would include servicing, labor, power, sampling parameters for effluent. And you would always include the cost of the biennial reporting, because you have to complete the form, the LSRP has to sign it, and you also include the annual permit fees. The value is calculated over the duration of the engineering control. So with in the groundwater situation, you would estimate the duration of the active system, for example. For a soil permit, we're considering the engineering control a permanent remedy. A permanent engineering control, which we will represent as 30 years. So with a estimate of $1,000 a year, the minimum value is $30,000 for a permanent engineering control. Next slide. Okay, we see there are pitfalls in establishing financial assurance. The main difficulties we see are knowing where to find the financial assurance instruments, choosing the right model financial instrument, and knowing how to identify a wrong financial instrument. Next slide. Okay, let's start with the last one first. The one thing you can do to identify a wrong financial instrument is look at the statute citations. Now, the Brownfields Act established remediation funding sources. And the citation is NJSA 58:10B-3. If you see this on a document, it is not financial assurance. The Site Remediation Reform Act establishes financial assurance. It's NJSA 58:10C. The citation will appear on all financial instruments for financial assurance. Next slide. Okay, where do we find these correct model documents? The easiest way is to go to the forms webpage. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom, count up 7 lines, you come to this very nifty link. It's called RFS Guide page. Click that link. Next slide. And you will come to the RFS FA guidance website. And you will see different groups of documents. Okay, the top one is for remediation funding sources. Using those documents is not correct for financial assurance. You would go to the next section, which is labeled Financial Assurance, FA, and it says to be used for remedial action permits only. Next slide. Okay, and there are reporting requirements for financial assurance. A remediation cost review is due biennially. It's done as part of the biennial certification. And what you're doing is documenting and reaffirming that the amount of the financial assurance is being maintained and it is correct. If there are any changes to the cost estimate, the actions taken must be indicated on the remediation cost review and RFS FA form. That's section C. You check all that apply. The next slide. Okay, then this is section C of the RFS FA form. Okay. Now, if you're using an existing remediation funding source as an FA, you would always check the very bottom one, which would be the using RFS as financial assurance. Now, if you're changing things, you would check this. There's one in the middle, change in remediation funding source or financial assurance amount, pursuant to the regs. Next slide. Some financial instruments require annual valuations, and these would be valuations and verifications that the amount is currently valid. And these apply specifically to a line of credit, a trust fund, a surety bond, and an environmental insurance policy. So again, you would verify that the mechanism is valid and in effect for the next 12 months. Now, letters of credit do not require an annual valuation. We'll talk about those in a bit. Next slide. Residential condominium associations are allowed to satisfy their financial assurance requirement by documentation of the annual association budget. Now, the budget should reflect the amount dedicated to the operation, maintenance, and inspection of the engineering control. And the association should indicate the line item that contain the permit costs, because it's often not obvious. They don't put permit and then an amount. They'll group it under things like administrative or or engineering or something like that. Please have a separate annotation as to which line item contains the permit costs and what the amount of the the cost for the permit is. Next slide. Okay, and here's a little hint. One thing you could do is, if you have an instrument that you will need annual valuations, you can send them directly to BRAP. If you do that, you don't need the RFSFA form. Okay. If you're sending it to BCANE, then you need the form, or else you may never see that again. And so specifically, valuation letters from trust fund trustees, banks or insurance companies, or condo association budgets can be submitted directly to BRAP. The key to it is to make the address as simple as possible. So if you're sending it through the mail, you would use the address on the left, which is the FA coordinator at the post office box. Okay, 08625 is the post office, is the zip code for state post office boxes. However, overnight couriers such as Federal Express, UPS, etc., will generally not deliver to a post office box, in which case use the street address. So again, it would be BRAP, the mail code 05S. That's an S as in Sam, not another 5. Sometimes it's misread. And you would use the street address, 401 East State Street. And our zip code here is 08608. Next slide. Okay, you might want to change the financial assurance amount or the mechanism type. Again, that requires filing of the remediation cost review and RFSFA form. If you are reducing or increasing the amount, provide a detailed cost estimate. Now, if you're just replacing the FA mechanism in a consistent amount, you're just changing a line of credit for a letter of credit, it just requires a form. And this does not require a permit modification as of the present rules. Next slide. Now you might need to make a change in the instrument itself. Okay, for a remediation trust fund, there is a section in the agreement, section 16, that allows amendments. And what you do is you make the changes, everybody has to initial it, and then you send it into the department to initial, and then we send it back to you. So it's really just as easy just to send in a new agreement, and we'll send the old one back. For a line of credit, a new document will usually be required. And for a surety bond or insurance policy, you check with your provider because it varies widely throughout the industry. Next slide. And letters of credit deserve their own slide because they are the most common form of financial assurance. You'll notice on the model document, it's an irrevocable standby letter of credit. That essentially means that any change to the letter requires an amendment, and almost any amendment will require the approval. Now, the approval will have to be sent as an amendment to the department. We will have to sign it and send it back. So please have the bank put the program interest number on the amendment. I've talked to banks, and letter of credit amendments are just push button documents. They don't have any information from the original letter of credit on the amendment. So they're not going to do it on their own. So please have the applicant, who's the customer, ask the bank to put the PI number on the amendment. That will get your amendment done a lot faster. Also, inform the department if a non-renewal notice is coming, because the same thing applies. There will be no information from the original letter on the non-renewal notice. So yeah, if they're canceling the letter and you're, establishing a trust fund or something, that's fine, but just let us know it's coming. So, I can be on the lookout for it. Next slide. And we'll take any questions. If there are any site-specific questions, you should email those directly to me at my email address.
Awesome, thanks, Mike. So far, we only have one question that came in through the QR code. So if you do have questions, go ahead and send them through. The first question is, and Mike, I don't know if DEP tracks this, so it could be that the answer is no, and that's okay. But does DEP have a breakdown on the use of the different financial assurance mechanisms?
No, we don't have specific numbers. I can tell you that letters of credit are the most common, followed by trust funds. And we only really have a handful of lines of credit, of insurance policies, of surety bonds, but surety bonds are fairly new. We're expecting surety bonds to become more popular because they generally seem to cost less, and they don't count against your credit rating. So expect people to be asking about them.
But we can call it if everybody wants
All
to.
right, great. Well, thank you, Mike.
Hi, everybody. It's 1:30, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our first DEP topical presentation. Thank you all for coming this afternoon and staying awake after lunch. Our first topic, we're going to be discussing common deficiencies with remedial action permits and applications and tips. And Michael Gaudio, the supervisor, is going to be giving the presentation and a quick background on Mike. Mike is the supervisor in the Bureau of Remedial Action Permitting, BRAP, and has been with BRAP since 2011. Mike is also the chairperson for the Remedial Action Permit Stakeholder Committee. He joined the department in 2003 and has spent 8 years as a case manager overseeing the investigation and remediation of contaminated properties subject to ISRA. So I'm going to go ahead and just from a ground rules perspective, obviously, the folks from the DEP are virtual, and so the Q&A, you can see on there, there's a QR code, and if you have questions throughout, go ahead and scan the QR code. It's going to send you to an Excel spreadsheet that folks on the other side of this are going to be able to review. If for some reason the QR codes fail or something like that, we may be able to take questions during the breaks and so forth, just understanding we're going to go from one presentation to the next. That said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Gaudio. As I was introduced, I'm supervisor with the Bureau of Remedial Action Permitting, also known as BRAP. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking about common deficiencies with both soil and groundwater app applications and some tips on how to address them. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see here, our mission in BRAP is to issue soil and groundwater apps that are protective of public health and safety and of the environment. Part of that mission is, BRAP's goal is to protect New Jersey residents and workers from direct contact to soil contamination and make sure we maintain a clean groundwater resource and restore and enhance any contaminated groundwater so that resource can be put back to its designated use or can be used in the future as needed. Designated uses include potable drinking water, irrigation, industrial water supply, maintenance of special ecological resources, and any other reasonable use. Remember, the goal here is to make sure that the residents of New Jersey are protected and can have a clean groundwater resource as soon as possible and make sure we can leave things as pristine as possible for future generations to enjoy. So next slide, please. Okay, so this slide and the next couple of slides will be focused on the most common deficiencies for both soil and groundwater RAP applications. The number one deficiency for both of them is that soil and the groundwater contamination is not horizontally and vertically delineated. It's important to note here that modeling of the contamination is not acceptable at the remedial action stage, and that the soil and groundwater contamination should be delineated using clean sampling points in all directions. I'm sure many of you remember the department established a policy statement on this in June 2013 regarding interpreting the technical requirement to complete the remedial investigation. And this was to help sites meet RI mandatory and regulatory timeframes for legacy sites and beyond. So hopefully this message is out there to everyone at this point, as this policy statement was sent out in numerous listservs, along with revisions to it, slight revisions to it along the way. I think the latest was in 2020. We also consistently reference this in our notice of technical deficiency letters to make sure that message is out there. And you can find this policy statement. It's on our site remediation guidance documents webpage, and it's under the administrative guidance section. Also, an important note here as it relates to groundwater contamination, the department establishing a CEA at the RI stage or pre-RAP does not mean acceptance of delineation where modeling of the contamination may have been used. I know people commonly take that CEA establishment pre-RAP and say, oh, the department was okay with everything. That's not always the case. All right, so the tips here, make sure you discuss how delineation was completed in the RAR. And Section K, other information of the RAP application. Make sure you indicate which clean points were used to complete the delineation. Provide a good map highlighting the clean sampling points in all directions with receptors on it, because that's the most important thing. Remember, knowing the complete extent of the soil and groundwater contamination in all directions is very important, as it affects the evaluation of receptors and determining or verifying trigger distance as it relates to the VI pathway and any potable or irrigation well sampling. Next slide, please. Probably the number two deficiency for all RAP applications is a lack of or no explanation for any variances for rules or deviations from guidance documents. This includes the lack of multiple lines of evidence to support professional judgment. The tip here is, make sure you provide as much explanation and discussion as necessary in the RAR and Section K of the RAP application. Make sure the RAR focuses on receptors and include multiple lines of evidence as necessary to support your professional judgment, and why the soil or groundwater remediation is protective of public health and safety and of the environment. Remember, the permit reviewer does not know the site history like you do. So the RAR should be like a book where anyone can pick it up and understand what happened at a site from start to finish. Lynn Mitchell, she'll talk a little bit more about this topic later on in her presentation. Next slide, please. Another common deficiency for all RAP applications is that the GIS compatible map of the CEA, D notice, or notice in lieu of D notice is not submitted by email to the department. As you can see, the appropriate email addresses are provided on this slide. This information is an important part of the institutional control for the site. So anyone can see where the contamination is for a site and make sure no one is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, like put in a potable well and groundwater contamination. Important to note, the CA shape stays mapped until the D notice can be terminated or the CA lifted. So tip here is simple. Make sure you email the GIS compatible map of the CA, the D notice, or notice in lieu of D notice just prior to submitting the RAP application. so it doesn't become a deficiency. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide, the next couple of slides are common deficiencies specifically for all groundwater RAP applications. The most common deficiency for all groundwater RAP applications is that the receptor evaluation is not complete for a site. This is the most important thing, and one of the first things the permit reviewer is looking at as it relates to RAP applications. And many times the door-to-door survey results are not provided, or the door-to-door survey is incomplete. Sometimes potable irrigation wells within the sampling trigger distance aren't sampled as required, or the VI pathway at a building is not investigated as required. And remember that VI trigger distances are from the edge of the groundwater contaminant plume, not a monitoring well itself. So the tips here, make sure, again, the RAR focuses on the evaluation of receptors and how trigger distances were determined. For VI purposes, make sure isopleth maps for the contaminants of concern that exceed the VI groundwater screening levels based on interpolation using real data is provided. And remember, the further your delineation points are from the source area, that increases the number of receptors that will need to be evaluated. So always keep that in mind when you're delineating. Diane Gard and Nicole Kalegan will talk more about the receptor evaluation later on in their presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, another common groundwater RAP application deficiency is issues with the CAA WRA fact sheet form, such as the CA shape is not acceptable, or the form is missing contaminants of concern, or cross-section figures. The cross-section figures are very important as part of that evaluation. The main tip here is draw your CA shape to the clean zone at the remedial action stage, as it should be based on actual data collected, and it's more protective of receptors. Also make sure the form includes all contaminants of concern above the groundwater remediation standards, and make sure to include all required exhibits. Next slide, please. Okay, another common groundwater RAP application deficiency are issues with the groundwater monitoring plan. Sometimes the groundwater monitoring plan is not even submitted, which is a problem in itself, but many times the groundwater monitoring plan is missing a sentinel well, or not enough wells, or if for triangulation. So groundwater flow could be determined to ensure that the remedial action will remain protective in the future. So we have seen groundwater flow change at sites, so it's important to have enough wells to be able to generate groundwater contour maps. Also, sometimes the proposed sampling frequency is not adequate based on the proximity of receptors in the area, or based on the fate and transport modeling that was provided. Tips here: make sure, again, keep receptors in mind when submitting the groundwater monitoring plan, and support sampling frequency and monitoring well selection in the RAR. Make sure the groundwater monitoring plan spreadsheet provided matches up with what you're proposing in the text of the RAR. A lot of times we see that doesn't quite match up. And remember, all groundwater apps are required to have a sentinel well. Next slide, please. Okay, and then another common deficiency with groundwater RAP applications is that the VI long-term monitoring plan is missing, where subslab soil gas contamination remains beneath the building. The long-term monitoring of this receptor is important, as building conditions can change, to make sure all the building occupants remain protected. The last bullet is just a note that, if subslab soil contamination is greater than the residential soil gas screening levels for non-res structure, then that needs to be part of the RAP to ensure site use does not change. So tip here is a simple one. Make sure, don't forget to include the VI issues with your groundwater RAP application, because we will document all this as part of your monitoring plan. Next slide, please. Okay, so for M&A, the biggest overarching deficiency with the M&A groundwater RAP applications is that M&A is not the appropriate remedial action for the site. This slide has a lot of common reasons why it's determined not to be appropriate. All contaminants are concerned and all monitoring wells should have a decreasing trend in them before applying for a groundwater RAP. If you don't have a decreasing trend, then you should be evaluating why. Maybe source material remains. Maybe you have another AOC that needs additional investigation at the site. Another, common reason is maybe you don't have enough groundwater sampling events conducted after the last remedial action at the site. As indicated in the M&A and groundwater RAP guidance, it's recommended that 8 rounds of groundwater sampling be conducted. 4 of those 8 rounds should be quarterly to make sure you're evaluating seasonal fluctuation. We understand that this is guidance and that there may be situations where less than 8 rounds may be acceptable, such as all source material is excavated and only low-level groundwater contamination remains. When you have those situations, provide your multiple lines of evidence to support your professional judgment on that deviation from guidance. Another common reason is that there's evidence of free and residual product remains at the site. Maybe you have a sheen on the water table or elevated contaminant levels remaining. So the tips here, make sure the RER supports why M&A is the appropriate groundwater remedial action, and make sure you conduct post-remedial sampling to demonstrate any product that was ever at the site no longer exists or has been removed. And remember, M&A of free and residual product is prohibited pursuant to the Tech Regs 5.1E. Next slide, please. For active groundwater RAP applications, many times the deficiency is just that the proposed remedial action is not acceptable, such as free product recovery in the form of SOX or HIT or EFR events that do not address the entire extent of the product body. These remedial actions, the department considers these remedial actions more of a short-term remedy than a long-term remedy. So the tips here, make sure that the active groundwater remedial action addresses the entire extent of the product body. Also make sure that the groundwater monitoring plan includes some type of post-remedial sampling. You want to make sure you have a game plan for when the active remediation is complete. And you can always contact BRAP with any questions on this, or request a technical consultation with the Bureau of Groundwater Pollution Abatement. And we also have a link here on this slide for your reference to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next couple of slides are common deficiencies specifically for all soil RAP applications. When it comes to historic fill, the soil RAP application and CAWR fact sheet form for historic fill should contain typical historic fill compounds. Tip here again is a simple one. Do not include or attribute VOCs or other non-related contaminants to historic fill. We still see it too often. Another common deficiency is that the migration of groundwater exposure pathway is not properly addressed, or not even addressed at all. The pathway exists and it's got to be properly addressed. Main tip here is, visit the department's remediation standards webpage. Read the guidance documents on the NGW exposure pathway. as it can be complicated. And there is a lot of information out there on it. Also, make sure to discuss in the RAR how the MGW exposure pathway was addressed, as well as in Section K of the initial soil wrap application. Remember, the migration of groundwater exposure pathway is not just about impacts to groundwater now, but potential impacts to groundwater in the future. Next slide, please. Another common soil wrap application deficiency is that the EPH soil contamination that remains isn't addressed in accordance with the department's evaluation of EPH and soil tech guidance document. Again, all free and residual product must be properly remediated. So the tips here, make sure to delineate to the applicable default product limits and remediate any EPH contamination in excess of the category 1 and 2 thresholds, or any alternative thresholds calculated. Remember, make sure to remediate all EPH contamination in excess of the 30,000 ppm ceiling limit. And again, make sure you read the department's guidance document on this issue to stay fresh on the topic. It's always a good idea to refresh on it. Next slide, please. And finally, as Mike and Fanger discussed in his presentation earlier, make sure you use the correct model FA document when an engineering control is in place, and FA is required for a RAP application. The FA model documents are located at the bottom of the RFS and FA guidance page. And the tip here again is a simple one. Make sure you don't use the RFS model when submitting a RAP application. Next slide, please. And that concludes my presentation. My email address is here if you have any questions that can't be answered now, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
My name is John Bailog. I currently work for BIR. I've been the point of contact for REO letters since our friend Gerald Hahn retired last year. I'm going to here today to talk about some REO updates, tips, and common areas we've been seeing recently. Next slide, please. First, I'd like to start off with a disclaimer. All the information we're about to talk about is strictly general. There's no site-specific items being talked about today. For any kind of site-specific scenario, just contact BIR first. We're trying to put that in your head now. Just so anything site-specific or not general, just contact BIR first for any sort of help on a specific topic. Next slide, please. All right, so starting off with some recent changes is a big one. It's the REO online service. All REOs are now submitted online through the online service portal. At this point, I think every phase of remediation now has a portal associated with it. We're trying to stray away from the paper copies, which includes the form. The REO form is done with, it's gone the way of the dodo. The online service now takes the place of both the REO letter and the REO form. We're asking that LSRPs don't complete the online service and submit a hard copy to BCANE. Hard copies of the REO letter should only be sent out to the other parties on the CC list. This just helps avoid us creating duplicate REO gray bars in our database. It keeps everything from getting disorganized. You can still submit them online via the SRP submissions email up there. We're trying to phase that out, but you still can for the time being if the portal's not working. Next slide, please. All right, so the REO guidance had a couple updates at the end of last year. There was one that happened in October, and then about a month later, it was updated again with some language fixes. Working backwards with the November 2021 update, we removed some language from section 5. That was about variations to response action outcomes. I believe the language previously mentioned issuing a limited restricted use REO for exceedances to migration to groundwater pathway. That was inappropriate. It was corrected. Exceedances to the migration to groundwater pathway would be remediated via capping and would actually therefore require an engineering control. So an actual restricted use would be the proper response. And beneath that, for section 6, pertaining to groundwater permits and groundwater remedies, that section of the guidance was reworked just to be a bit more clear and concise and to provide some quality of life improvements when comparing the REO guidance with the groundwater RAP guidance. Next slide, please. The REO guidance document now has clear guidance on the REO withdrawal process. Previously, there was no official guidance offered for withdrawing an REO letter, but now there's actually some written guidance in the back of the REO guidance document. It starts on page 54, included as attachment 3. There's a model language withdrawal letter provided if an LSRP would choose to use it. You could still do a custom withdrawal letter, but we do have model language now just to help with the whole process. You would still work with whatever inspector and reviewer looked at the REO letter while going through the withdrawal process. But just so LSPs are aware, there's now a guidance available on withdrawing REOs at the back of the guidance document. Next slide, please. Working past that, a slew of new notices were added to the REO guidance document, starting with the biggest portion were the commingled plume notices. There are 3 different ones available, each for a different commingled plume scenario. These will be updated to the regulations as part of the REO shell document. And again, there are 3 of them up there. I could put all the language up here, but it'd be a bunch of legal language. So to save time and space on my slides, those are the titles of each of the notice. They're to be used when groundwater plumes are, you guessed it, mingled together beneath your site. The first one up there is to be used in place of the usual offsite source notice when plume contaminants are similar. Just like the regular offsite source notice, it requires a PA or offsite source investigation. The other 2 notices, the center one and the bottom one, are to be used when a contaminant plume has been remediated with a groundwater RAP and a CEA, but other plumes from on-site sources remain, either of similar or dissimilar constituents. Next slide, please. More new notices. Okay, the transfer of monitoring well use. This one's pretty handy. It's used to indicate that a well on your site is being left open. Normally, after doing an investigation, wells would be sealed once the remediation is complete, and then you'd include the well decommissioning notice in the REO. But as long as there are other cases still active on the site that require groundwater remediation, you can use this notice to transfer the use of the monitoring well to that new case. And of course, it requires an incident number and PI number for that other case that's remaining open. Next slide, please. There you go. Vapor intrusion notices. There's 2 of these ones. The first is the indeterminate vapor intrusion pathway, not yet evaluated notice. This is to be used when you have groundwater above the vapor intrusion screening level, but your site use includes the contaminant above screening level in question. Think active service stations, dry cleaners, refinery operations, etc. It just states that you as an LSRP are aware groundwater is above vapor intrusion screening level, but there's no point in trying to remediate right now because it's actively being used at the site. It would go away, or a VA evaluation should be conducted after change in site use or the site gets redesignated from a commercial to a residential, or chemicals associated with the vapor trigger are no longer used. So it's just used when the contaminant is above vapor intrusion screening level and it's still being used at the site. The other notice below that one is the long-term vapor intrusion monitoring notice. This is used to notify the responsible party of their obligation that they still need to consider VI into the future. It's to be used when you have contamination above soil gas screening levels, but below indoor air screening levels. So the pathway isn't complete yet, but monitoring has to continue to make sure it doesn't ever exceed indoor air screening levels. I believe Nicole is going to be talking about this more as we continue into the afternoon, so she'll go over these in more depth later on. Next slide, please. Okay, so attachment 4, this is the new section of the REO guidance document, back on page 56. We assembled a couple of common, frequently occurring scenarios that are kind of complex. And attachment 4 goes over each of these strange scenarios that we've been seeing a lot of. We included this just because a lot of questions were coming in on these from a lot of different LSRPs, so it seemed like there were frequently occurring scenarios. So before calling us, you might have a situation that could be in the back of the REO guidance document at this point. It's actually proven pretty handy to date. I would give it a look, just check it out, see what's in there, because it's a good chance whatever strange scenario you have might be included in the back of the REO guidance document now. Next slide, please. All right, so working past the language updates, the new notices, withdrawal guidance, things like that. I went around to the other REO inspectors in our bureau and I compiled a list of recent REO issues we've been encountering. There's always the typical issues, tank discrepancies and address block and lots being off, but these are stranger issues that have been occurring more frequently recently. And I just wanted to compile them here just to set the record straight. The first one up there, we've been getting a lot of REOAs for areas of concern, and the scope of remediation will simply refer to them as AOC1 or AOC2, so on and so forth. It's insufficient. You have to specify what AOC1 or 2 actually is. It's a public document. It has to be available for the responsible party and anyone doing an open request. A person reading the REO letter should understand what was taken care of at the property. Working off of that, the scope of remediation should be for the contamination or the source of the contamination, not a general vague impacted media. Putting just groundwater or site soils on your REO scope isn't specific enough, and it could leave what's been taken care of and not taken care of open to interpretation, especially when you have multiple contaminants affecting the same media. And below that, for one reason or another, we've been getting a lot of ISRA multi-tenant REOs, leaseholds, and the language of the notice states to include a map on the REO letter, and no maps have been coming in. So just be sure if you're using the multi-tenant notice and you have an ISRA leasehold that you are tacking the map onto the back of the REO letter as an attachment. Next slide. Continuing on, this is a big one and is an issue and will probably remain an issue, but data miner is your friend. The USTs on your SID and your REO should correspond to the current UST registration database. So if you're issuing an REO for a tank closure and the tanks are still listed as being in the ground, or the size or contents of one doesn't add up or match with whatever's on the UST registration, make sure it all matches. You can submit a UST facility questionnaire. You can use data miner. Just make sure it all matches up. Below that, similar situation. Use data miner, see what incident numbers are open at the site are under your case. Anything being closed out with an REO should be tacked up at the beginning of the REO letter in the RE section. And below that, anything unaddressed with this REO under your case that's being left open should probably be called out with a notice. All notices have language specifically for entering incident numbers into them. It just helps with our case tracking to see what's open and not open at a site. Next slide. This is one that's been popping up recently. The well decommissioning notice, just so everyone's aware, there are 2 different variations available for this notice. The first option should only be used when all site-related wells have been decommissioned. The second option is used in limited restricted use REOs when some have been decommissioned, but others are remaining open to keep up with the monitoring. So a clear, concise difference between the 2 available notices. Make sure you understand the difference. And next slide. Moving on with some more REO issues. This is a big one, which is causing a lot of duplicate REO gray bars in our database. Any sort of amendment should be worked with whatever inspector asked the amendment to be issued. Work with them and submit the amendment to them. Don't submit the amendment separately via the REO service. It actually became so much an issue that we had a big red bold text at the end of the REO service stating, do not submit amendments through the service. It should be submitted separately to the inspector or reviewer that asked for it. Next slide, please. Each phase of remediation completed needs to be certified with each applicable online portal service. I thought the best way to explain this would be the most frequent example. We get a lot of reports labeled remedial investigation / remedial action report, and the LSRP will only do the remedial action service. Only doing the RA service for a report labeled RI, RA won't end date the remedial investigation to be completed task. Each service for each phase of remediation completed has to be signed and certified by the LSRP. It could be the same report, it would just be uploaded and submitted via each separate online portal. Next slide, please. And finally, this one's been coming up a lot recently, with the new SID especially. I meant to have a picture, but I seem to have forgotten. But there are 2 columns in the SID. One's over to the left, that's where you put your incident number. That would be the first incident number for an offsite source when it's first initially discovered. If you're keen on the offsite source guidance document, once you do the PA and the offsite source is confirmed, you're issued a second confirmed verified unknown source number, and that would go all the way over into the rightmost column, the activity column of the SID. it was becoming an issue because LSRPs were putting both incident numbers in the leftmost incident number column, and that would tack both incident numbers under the case, and it would just make us have to do a lot of unnecessary data cleanup. So just be aware, check out the offsite source guidance document and the SID guidance document and make sure you're putting the 2 incident numbers for offsite source cases into the appropriate columns. Next slide, please. So here's the REO point of contact. That's myself. My email's there. I prefer email. It gives me a chance to look over the guidance documents and give you an appropriate answer. My phone number is also up there. And if you're aware of how the REOs work, any sort of modified language has to be okayed through our upper management. Atwood Davis's email and phone number are available right there for any sort of language approval request. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
See you
John.
around.
Thanks, John.
Anytime.
Hi, everybody. We're going to be talking about documentation of professional judgment and other tips. Our instructor this afternoon is Lynn Mitchell, and I don't have my glasses on, so I'm about ready to butcher poor Lynn's credentials here. Lynn has worked for the department for over 30 years and is currently the Assistant Director of the Remediation Review Element, the Bureau of Inspection and Review, and the Bureau of Remedial Action Permitting. All those groups, sorry, report to Lynn. Sorry, I don't have glasses on, so I butchered what your credentials were. My apologies.
Not a problem.
So similar to all the other presentations, if you've been them, Lynn's going to give her presentation. We'll have time for questions. The QR code takes you to an Excel spreadsheet, and you fill out what may seem like an awful lot of information, but it's so that everybody can get back to you. Also, I can walk around with the microphone. Remembering to keep your questions generic. If you have a very specific site question, that's something that we'll want everybody to reach out to the department directly for. So I will go ahead and kick it off. Thanks, Lynn.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Lynn Mitchell, and I'm going to be discussing the documentation of professional judgment. I'd like to make the point now that the title of this presentation is the documentation of the professional judgment. In the past, I have given presentations on professional judgment, but the issue is not the professional judgment that we're receiving, it's the documentation of it. So that's the point I want to make and make it that very clear this afternoon. Next slide, please. So when the department asks you for more information, it's to ensure that our record is complete, that the record that we have, that somebody may look at 5 years from now, 20 years from now, will be able to understand your thoughts, your reasonings, and how you got to where you did, and that the record is complete. We want to make sure the professional judgment is clear. We understand what's going on at the site, but we want to make sure that everybody who looks at the site can understand it. The majority of the time, the department agrees with the LSRP's conclusion once we have the professional judgment fully documented. So again, this is all about documentation, documentation, documentation. Next slide, please. So what is the documentation of your professional judgment? It's every single thing you thought of that impacted your decision at the site, how those factors influenced it, and a full written discussion of everything that you evaluated. If you thought it, we want to know about it. It is not a written statement, and I'll give you an example of this in a few minutes, that the professional judgment was utilized without anything else, because that doesn't mean anything to us, and it won't mean anything to people 5, 15, 20 years from now. We no longer really get too many that are focused solely on cost, so thank you for that. But again, documentation of what you thought of is what's important. Next slide, please. So examples of your professional judgment are your multiple lines of evidence. It's every technical justification that you had to do what you did. It's your full detailed analysis. It's all of your data that you evaluated. It's everything that you thought of that makes your decision accurate at the end of the day. We want all of that submitted in the documents that you provide to us. Next slide, please. A reminder, the permit writer, your inspector reviewer, they do not have previous knowledge of the site. We no longer have case managers, so if they're looking at a remedial action report, they probably are not the same person who looked at the PA-SI-RI that was submitted. So you have to make sure that your reports are complete. It's required by the rules, and we need to make sure that everything is included. The permit writers, inspectors, and reviewers do not have copies of previous submittals. So if an RI was submitted, unless it was done through the portal, we do not have access to that. We have to do the same thing you do. We have to go up to the 6th floor, request a file review, and sit up there and get everything, get all of the information, and review the entire report. So it is, we would appreciate it. It would make things go faster for us. It would also, it makes the report complete that you put everything that you had investigated in your RI into your RA. So if there were areas concerned or parts of the plume that were delineated in the RI, make sure that's documented in your RA. And again, the permit writer, inspector, reviewer, they don't know what's going on neighboring properties. It's not like, I know when I was in the field office, we had people who had certain regions and certain areas, and we got to know all of the cases in those areas. Well, the permit writers may not know that. So if that's part of your reasoning, please make sure you include that. Next slide, please. So here is something that we received. This is insufficient justification. We commented that the plume wasn't delineated, and we literally got back that based on my professional judgment, it was. Now, it may very well be that those wells delineated it, but we need to have more information. Provide all of your thoughts and reasonings as to all of the areas of concern when upfront, but it definitely when we ask you and submit a request for more information, please give us all the information that you have on that. Next slide, please. Here's another situation where we did not have sufficient documentation in their response to the notice of technical deficiency. Yes, the response was had a lot of information, but it didn't include the construction details of the potable well. And when we're asking questions about the potable well, the construction details are very important. So keep that in mind when you're responding. Respond as fully as you can with all the information that you have regarding a particular question. And again, if you have it in your report up front, that's even better. Next slide, please. Here's an example of sufficient documentation. Here was a site that the LSRP had plans on taking subslab soil gas samples, but could not. They fully explained why they could not. They explained what they were able to do, and then they further went on to explain why they felt that what they were able to do was sufficient. This is important that we get responses like this in the reports up front, and then we would have no further questions as to why you didn't take your sample. Next slide, please. Things that would help us to support your professional judgment would be a clear table of contents. If we know where to go to in the report that would answer our questions, it helps a lot. We have put on the revised RAP forms that if you are deviating from guidance, varying from rules, we asked you what section of the report that's in. Please use that the forms for that and identify that information for us, because then it makes it real easy for the permit writer or the inspection reviewer to go exactly to where they need to go to find what you were thinking and how you came to your conclusion. Again, detailed information with multiple lines of evidence. And if you are citing previous submittals because they're relevant to your conclusion, put that in as part of your report. Make it an appendix if you don't want to include it in the body of the report. One of the people on our training committee liked this quote from the VIT, which states that professional judgment is not designed to be a mathematical calculation, but rather drawing a conclusion based on a progression of imperial facts, some more relevant than others. So again, it's everything that you were thinking. And some may, you might have some thoughts and those didn't work out. Include them, because it's nice to know that was an area that you went down and didn't work out. Everything that is used as part of your professional judgment is important to us and should be documented. Next slide, please. So some common deficiencies, some of these were discussed earlier today, but I wanted to take the opportunity to go over them with you now. Failure to provide the multiple lines of evidence. A lot of our letters go out asking for more documentation. We have administrative errors in deed notices where Mike went over this earlier, and he explained that if you make a mistake on your deed notice, you write wrong information, you don't put the contaminants correctly, or any kind of mistake with the deed notice, we then have to ask you to revise it, and that takes months to get that done. Mike Invanger went over the fact that FA, we typically, about 50% of the financial assurance documents that we get are wrong because they use the wrong citation for the FA. They use the RFS citation from Brownfields and not the citation from Sarah. So it's important that you use the correct citation or their financial instrument will be rejected. And again, that takes more time to get that fixed. And John Baylog just went over numerous errors in the RAO. Again, incorrect lots and blocks, mistakes made with the incident numbers in the wrong spots, wrong notices, not fully, going over what the notice of what areas of concern are being included. All of those things are important and slow up the process for us. So if you could put the extra effort into making sure that information is correct, that would help all of us. Failure to complete the RI for all receptors. If you don't, for the RI for your eco receptors as well as VI, they must be fully delineated. You can't extrapolate that. And for your RA, you can't extrapolate anything. So we need you to delineate point-by-point compliance at the end of the remedial action phase. Next slide, please. So we all know that variance from the tech regs is okay, as long as you have your sufficient justification, as well as deviations from guidance are acceptable, but they must be documented in your key document submittals. We need to know what you're doing. Some things are not negotiable regarding the, that you cannot vary from, and those are listed in 1.7b of the tech regs. Next slide. And here is 1.7b. You can't vary from the requirement to obtain a permit. You can't vary from the requirement to get department's written approval. There are certain things that you can't vary from. So please don't try to submit a document requesting a variance from these things. Next slide, please. Every variance that we do receive is a review trigger and will be evaluated by BIR, if not by BRAP. So it's something that we wanted to let you know. Many of you may have submitted variances in your reports and were never contacted because we reviewed them and accepted them right off the top of the bat because we had the sufficient justification for it. Don't skimp on any of the information that you provide to us. Next slide, please. So again, my final notes, don't skimp on your information. Tell us everything. I've explained this in the past as, think about this as like you're an attorney, you're in court, you want to, start your report with giving us, what you plan on doing, your opening statement. Make sure that all of your evidence is put forth in the report and that you conclude it with a full explanation so that we understand where you're coming from. We want the whole story, everything that you thought, we want it in there. And we agreed with the LSRP's decision the majority of the time once we understand them. So it's very important that we have all of the information up front. And my last note is please be nice to my staff when they reach out to you for more information. They are just trying to make sure that the record is complete. They will ask you questions. The information may be already in the report. They couldn't find it. Maybe they missed it, made a mistake. Just let them know where it is. Just give them the information, and we can all just move on from there. And that's my final notes. Next slide. Any questions?
Thanks, Lynn. So far, we don't have any questions that came in through the QR code. Mike, are you all ready?
Yeah, so welcome everyone. Thank you for attending on day 2 of our conference. I am Mike Poland, your moderator for today, and we have 2 DEP representatives going to speak on receptor evaluations and vapor intrusion investigations. So just a housekeeping issue. If you haven't been to one of the sessions yet, we do have Q&A performed by QR codes. So on each of your desks, snap a picture of that QR code, which will bring you to a Google form, and you can enter your name, email, and info for your Q&A, which the DEP will read. We urge you not to get site-specific. Any site-specific questions can go directly to the DEP outside of their presentation. Please submit your questions to those DEP reps. But again, we thank the DEP for participating in today's presentation. We'll have Diane Gard speaking on receptor evaluations. Diane is a supervisor in the Bureau of Inspection and Review. She serves as the DEP contact for receptor evaluations. Likewise, Nicole Kalajian will be speaking on VI investigation issues. Nicole is a research scientist in the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment. Nicole serves as the DEP contact for VI investigation and mitigation, as well as EPH, and she is an ecological risk assessor. So again, thank you, ladies, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Gard, and as Mike introduced me, I am a supervisor in the Bureau of Inspection and Review. I am also here as the point contact person for the receptor questions, and that I supervise the receptor review team. Next slide. So I have one clarification that I would like to make about receptor evaluations right off the bat. As you all know, if an unrestricted use REO is issued within a year, you do not have to submit the receptor evaluation form. But I would like to point out that there is one caveat to that per 1.12 of the tech regs, and that is an exception pursuant to 1.16 of the tech regs, which states, next slide please, that the ecological evaluation is still required. So if there was any contamination above standards at your site, an eco-evaluation is required to be conducted. So even though a receptor evaluation form may not be required, the information is expected to be found in the text of the report. In that, you need to discuss, are there any ecologically sensitive natural resources located on or adjacent to a site or may have been impacted by the site? And next slide, please. Was there any contamination present above the eco screening criteria or aquatic surface water quality standard, or both if they both apply? Again, this information is expected to be in the text of the report submitted for whichever remedial phase document applies to your remediation conducted. Next slide, please. So back to some general housekeeping on receptor evaluations. As a reminder, even if groundwater contamination never left your site, you still need to perform a well search. Any wells identified within the specified distances means that wells could have been installed in the area historically, and the door-to-door survey is then required. Remember, with the door-to-door survey, we are looking for the unpermitted wells. We're not just looking for you to confirm identification of any potable wells that the well search found. The department expects 100% response rate. If you can't get 100%, you need to demonstrate how you can ensure that nobody's drinking contaminated groundwater and that receptors are being protected. please remember the department's #1 job and LSRP's, by extension, is to protect human health and the environment. If you find any potable or irrigation wells within the specified distance in the tech regs, then sampling must be conducted. And as discussed previously, the eco evaluation must be conducted. Next slide, please. The receptor evaluation is an iterative process. It should be a living document for your case. It's not just a form. Even if an updated form's not due to the department, it's expected that as an LSRP, you're constantly reviewing the site data and looking for potential receptors and evaluating them. All the receptors must be reevaluated anytime the nature and extent of the discharge is increased, if a new AUC or a new receptor is identified, or if a new exposure pathway is identified. This is an updated evaluation. It's not just an updated form. So the updated receptor evaluation form is required with an IEC source control report, an RI report, and also with an RA report. And when submitting any of these, please do not just change the date of a previously submitted form and submit that. That's not acceptable. And in BIR, we will call you out on it and ask for an updated receptor evaluation. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about some common issues that my team sees. One thing that they saw a lot, especially during COVID times, was the lack of that door-to-door survey. So during COVID, remediation was always considered essential. Those door-to-door surveys should have been completed. We had modified ways that we had accepted what was done. A lot of people started with letters, and that was perfectly acceptable to the department. Now that the world's a little closer to normal, we're not seeing that issue quite as much, but we do still see it a surprisingly amount of time. The well search needs to be updated every 2 years until the remedial action is complete and an RAO is issued. Per the listserv that was sent out about a year or so ago, the remedial action is not considered complete until your RA is issued. So we expect you to continue to update that well search until that time. Even if historic fill is the only contaminant at the site, the eco evaluation is still required. And I will refer you to the eco evaluation technical guidance, section 5.0, for more details on that. Next slide, please. So I'm only going to touch on the VI issues now because Nicole Kalajian is going to be talking next, and she's going to go into much greater detail about VI. So my VI team sees the following issues the most: an insufficient number of soil gas samples with no explanations on why. If the VIT recommends you do 5 samples based on your building size and you only do 2, you should be explaining your professional judgment on why you made that decision and how it's protective. The department needs to see your multiple lines of evidence you used in your decision-making process. Hopefully you were able to attend Lynn Mitchell's talk earlier about professional judgment for more clarity on that topic. They're also seeing a lot of data of over 5 years old, which is not representative of site conditions. If you continue to have a groundwater trigger at your site where you're triggering a vapor intrusion investigation, you need to update your data to consider the spatial and temporal changes at the site. Indoor air sampling needs to be conducted regardless of whether the contaminant you found in soil gas was also found in groundwater. An example of that is you have a retail petroleum station where your contaminants of concern are BTEX. You do your soil gas sampling and you find PCE in soil gas. You can't just say, I didn't find BTEX and I'm not going to do indoor air. You found PCE, you have to do the indoor sampling. We need to ensure that receptors are being protected. The last thing there is you need to draw a conclusion. using your multiple lines of evidence and your professional judgment. We need to close the loop. Show us exactly what your train of thought was so that we can understand it. Remember, it's the LSRP's responsibility to connect all those dots. It's not the department's responsibility to try to figure it out. Next slide, please. So a vapor intrusion investigation must be conducted even if a building's not occupied, if it won't be occupied, if it's planned to be raised. If a building is scheduled to be raised within a month, you've got equipment scheduled, everything is planned out. The department's not going to make you go investigate that building. If anything changes, you would. If a building is scheduled to be raised within 6 months, you must investigate. We all know how things can change and sometimes plans fall through. We do not want anybody to be moved into that building if it may be impacted. So you are required to sample those buildings. If contamination is suspected to be from an off-site source, until you complete your off-site source investigation and issue an RAO, your client is still responsible for ensuring receptors are not impacted. That means, again, you need to continue on with the vapor intrusion investigation and do the sampling. Next slide, please. If you trigger VC or IEC conditions, you need to file those forms in accordance with the tech regs. After you file the form, if you can make a case as to why that condition doesn't apply, please do so, because the immediate concern unit could then possibly close your case as long as they agree with you. Because we are trying to protect receptors first and foremost, if you have the condition, please report it. Next slide, please. You need to demonstrate that receptors are protected to today's standards. Until all receptors are addressed, the RI is not considered complete. Even if you have an old department letter from 2006 approving a baseline eco evaluation that says no further evaluations required, that's just one line of evidence. You need to provide your professional judgment using multiple lines of evidence on how receptors are protected to today's standards. Next slide, please. And here's our RI complete policy statement, which I said earlier today in the office is my favorite thing in the world. It just makes things very clear for my team. First, you need to determine the nature and extent of the discharge. You need to be able to choose a remedial action, and highlighted in red is the most important part to my team. Number 2, the impacts and potential impacts to receptors in all media must be determined. If your receptors are not fully investigated, your RI is not complete. If timeframes were missed, your site may be subject to direct oversight. The department cannot budge on this. Receptors are the #1 priority. Next slide. At this time, I'll be happy to take any questions, though if you have any VI questions, you may want to hold off until after Nicole's presentation, and then I'll stick around and we can continue to take questions at that time. So my contact and Nicole's contact are listed here. If you have site-specific questions, please feel free to reach out to either one of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane.
We had a little brief introduction earlier, but again, my name is Nicole Kalajian. I'm with the Bureau of Environmental Evaluation and Risk Assessment, and I'm the SRP contact for vapor intrusion mitigation and investigation. I also do some work with EPH, and I also do some ecological risk assessing. So like many of us at the DEP, I wear several hats as well. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the vapor intrusion technical guidance. There were some updates that occurred, and also just a few clarifications and maybe give additional information as to what the department sometimes looks for with respect to the evaluation of the VI exposure pathway. Next slide, please. This some folks are probably familiar with this page. These are sort of a consolidated page of all the VI resources that we have in SRP. You can find the website right there at that particular address. You can just do a simple Google search for NJDEP vapor intrusion and it'll pop this page up as well. This sort of represents all of the specific guidance that's been developed by the department to assist in the investigation of the vapor intrusion exposure pathway at contaminated sites in New Jersey. So you can't really see it very well in this particular screenshot, but there's additional resources like the TCE, health risk information, other fact sheets, links to previous listservs and things like that on the right-hand side of the column there. So this is a great resource to have. If you have a habit of bookmarking things, I would refresh it because again, it's all kind of been updated in the past year or so. So I would re-bookmark that. Next slide, please. So I think we all know by now that May 2021 was kind of a big deal in SRP land, given that the remediation standards were adopted. And along with that, there was a lot of updates and rewrites of various guidance documents within the department, the VIP being no exception to that. So in May 2021, we released VIP version 5.0. And the big notable change to that was Appendix G, and this was specifically to reflect the adoption of the remediation standards. So the big change was that the indoor air screening levels were changed to indoor air remediation standards. And some of those values have changed, just like some of the vapor intrusion screening level values have changed. There's also detailed guidance on the development of the alternative indoor air remediation standards and vapor intrusion screening levels contained within that appendix. There's also information on the development of alternative vapor intrusion screening levels, which has always been permitted when appropriate, but with the rule adoption, we released a calculator to assist in the development of those alternative screening levels and remediation standards. So that calculator can be used to develop ARSs for only non-residential exposure scenarios. And that calculator can be found on the remediation standards webpage. This particular calculator can't be used to develop alternative groundwater screening levels because those are handled a little bit differently, but there is a table with alternative groundwater screening levels based on soil texture provided in the updated vapor intrusion screening level tables. And all those tables can again be found on that VI Everything website. And the last bullet here, again, just with respect to what kind of changed in the VIT was there was another sort of update to the coordination with and submittal to the New Jersey Department of Health for your VI related information. Next slide, please. So the typical trigger for an investigation of the VI exposure pathway is typically due to groundwater contamination above the vapor intrusion groundwater screening levels. So in that case, the department requires a vapor intrusion investigation for these trigger distance listed here. So it's 100 feet for non-petroleum hydrocarbon related contamination and 30 feet for petroleum hydrocarbon related contamination. And this is with respect to the vertical and horizontal distances. So where groundwater is the vapor source, the trigger distances are applied from the edge of the groundwater plume, and this is based on linear interpolation of groundwater data. And this is not with respect to a monitoring well itself. And so those buildings are the ones that are subject to having this vapor intrusion investigation. I recall Mike Gaudio hammering that point a little bit earlier as well. So a person cannot just assume that the VI pathway is incomplete based on the collection of a groundwater sample at a distance less than this 100 feet or 30 feet, those trigger distances. So, you know, those trigger distances are based on the migration of the vapors through the soil, through the vadose zone, and that's regardless of the presence of contaminated groundwater within that distance. So those, as I mentioned before, those are applied, you know, exclusively to the horizontal and vertical distances from the contaminated plume or the product contaminated area if that's applicable. So we'll go into a little bit more detail and kind of visualize that on the next slide. So next slide, please. So this is a standard kind of example of how the department sees a lot of the VI investigations completed and submitted. So oftentimes the investigator will apply those trigger distances that we just talked about from the monitoring well, as you can see here. So you can kind of see those 3 monitoring wells there, and then you see the circle drawn around it, and that's a 100-foot radius there. So let's say our site has a contaminated groundwater plume, and that contaminated groundwater exceeds the VI groundwater screening levels. So also let's say that there are a couple sentinel wells between the plume and some offsite properties around. And let's say those sentinel wells come up non-detect for your contaminants of concern. So in your mind, would a vapor intrusion investigation still be required for some of those offsite buildings? So again, remembering that just because there is not the groundwater contamination is not in that well, or maybe it's not directly located under those buildings, doesn't necessarily mean that VI is not occurring, right? As I mentioned before, VI is based on the migration of the vapors through the vadose zone and not the presence or absence of contaminated groundwater within that distance. So let's take a look at that a little bit more closely on the next slide, please. So this is a little bit more of what the department wants to see and what, face value here would be considered a complete investigation in accordance with the tech regs. So again, the question that I posed earlier, is the vapor intrusion investigation still required at some of those surrounding properties? And I hope that you answered yes. And this picture is why. So again, this is assuming this is a volatile organic compound plume that we've got here. All the buildings outlined in red are the ones within that 100-foot trigger distance from the edge of the plume. So again, remember we drew our little circles around the monitoring wells. We did a 100-foot radius from there. We weren't really touching any of the buildings, but now if we take a 100-foot radius around the plume itself, we can see that there are several buildings. It looks like there's about 8 or 9 off-site buildings that are within that 100-foot trigger distance. So based on the wells alone, none of those buildings were screened in, which means they probably weren't investigated, which also therefore means that your RI is incomplete because you did not do the receptor evaluation per the tech regs, which also means that the exposure pathway remains unaddressed and potentially receptors are being affected. Diane, who just presented, we work really closely and her team of reviewers, and this is certainly one of the biggest, issues that we do see, and also why RIs are sometimes, marked incomplete, or we have to reach out to the LSRP to have them withdraw. While we're on this particular figure, another issue that we see in this scenario is the number of samples collected for subslab soil gas and indoor air is fewer than the VIT recommends, which again, Diane did touch upon. So the tech regs do specify for all media that an appropriate number of samples in appropriate locations must be collected to fully evaluate each pathway. So in addition to not enough samples, what we often see is that the sampling is sort of skewed to one side of the building. And the reasoning for that is because the part of the building overlays the plume, or it's closer to the plume. As you can kind of see in that northwestern sort of building there's only a portion of it that is sort of within that 100-foot trigger distance. However, what's not being considered in that is the potential for preferential pathways, any kind of subsurface utilities, things that may act as a conduit to potentially have a greater vapor impact for the rest of the building there. So again, if your 100-foot sort of buffer area there around the plume does screen in a building, that whole building should be evaluated really for protectiveness. And just as a general disclaimer, these figures were put together this isn't an actual site. This is literally just picking a point on a map, and by no means should this represent a complete delineation or investigation or anything like that. Just wanted to add that disclaimer and caveat these particular images with that. Next slide, please. So just a few more points on the groundwater trigger. So if the depth to the shallowest groundwater exceeds 100 feet, A VI investigation isn't required unless, again, those vertical preferential pathways exist, or if your conceptual site model indicates there's a potential VI risk. So again, if there's maybe a known VOC source in the VADO zone, if there is a series of really robust underground conduits and utilities, that might be another one of those sort of considerations for making sure that you do a VI investigation. Another sort of clarification is that generally groundwater data that's 5 years old may not be representative of current site conditions. So additional groundwater should be collected just to really have a better picture of what's going on at your site. Oftentimes also what we see is there are instances where historical groundwater data are discovered during, some either a PASI or something like that, and perhaps a VI investigation never occurred. So at that point, it is the LSRP's obligation to complete the receptor evaluation and evaluate the VI exposure pathway. And your time frame and the clock kind of starts with the date of that historic data discovery. Next slide, please. So the department often refers to the investigation of VI as an iterative process, and the VIT actually states it a few different times as well. And this is due to sort of the various triggers that can extend or prolong a VI investigation. So another clarification here is that if there is an exceedance of the indoor air remediation standards in a building, a VI investigation must be completed, which includes sampling for all buildings within 100 feet of the impacted building, and that's irrespective of the contaminants of concern involved. So at that point, we just discussed trigger distances with respect to groundwater. At this point, you kind of have a new trigger, if you want to think about it that way, where the trigger is that building. So all buildings within 100 feet of that impacted one are required to be evaluated in a step-out investigation. So again, the building itself becomes the trigger for the next step of the investigation. And the timeframes for the step out are consistent with those in the receptor evaluation for a vapor concern or an IEC, whichever is applicable for that building trigger. Again, Diane covered the receptor evaluation earlier, but to reiterate, updating the receptor evaluation doesn't mean putting a new date on the form and submitting it. So there's several examples where a receptor evaluation needs to be updated. For example, groundwater concentrations increasing at a site. A VI investigation may be necessary to ensure those receptors are properly addressed. If additional receptors or buildings are identified as a result of step-out sampling, the receptor evaluation must be updated. Oftentimes, the department will evaluate a submittal where the VI investigation was performed 10 plus years ago, but some of the site conditions have since changed, or concentrations in groundwater have changed, or a new discharge occurs. All of these are examples when another VI investigation may be necessary, and therefore a new receptor evaluation. In addition to the updated receptor evaluation for those required deliverables as outlined in the tech regs, just a couple of examples are listed here, which I think I already mentioned. So this is more specifically for VI. And again, new data means a better and more robust investigation and more protectiveness for those potential receptors. Next slide, please. So again, Diane touched upon this a little bit, but I'm just going to go into a little bit further detail. So every building, regardless of whether it's occupied, must be investigated for vapor impacts if any of the conditions at 1.15A of the tech regs are met. So if the VI pathway is investigated and found to be complete in an unoccupied building, some form of mitigation is typically necessary. So the department gets a lot of inquiries regarding IEC conditions in unoccupied buildings, and sometimes those buildings are going to be raised or retrofitted or something of the sort, but they're unoccupied at the time, and so they don't know either what to do, or again, that's even if the investigation was performed. So again, to be clear, SARA 2.0 says that all structures, regardless of whether or not they're occupied, must be investigated to determine whether there are vapor impacts. There's no exception to the requirement to do a vapor intrusion investigation here. So moving on from that is if an IEC condition is confirmed in an unoccupied building, SARA 2.0 does allow for an exception to remediate at that point. And then this is sort of where the latitude and professional judgment on what the LSRP and PRCR can do. So the LSRP and the PRCR must provide to the department certified documents from the property owner that the building is unoccupied, will remain unoccupied, and that the building will be demolished. So that is certified documentation for all those things. At this point, a mitigation is not necessarily necessary because of those three conditions, if those three conditions are met. So basically, SARA 2.0 gives you an out for what you're going to do with the results of the investigation, but it does not give you an out from actually conducting that investigation. So that's very clear. And if you have any questions about that, certainly reach out to me, but that is sort of how it stands right now. Also, vacant land. Vacant land does not require a VI investigation per the tech regs, since triggers are tied to actual buildings for evaluation. But exterior soil gas data can be used, of course, as a field screening tool or as a supplementary line of evidence in the evaluation of the VI exposure pathway. Next slide, please. Indeterminate VI pathway status. This was a new concept in the last iteration of the VIT released in 2018. So indeterminate VI pathway status is defined as a situation where a building on a site would trigger a VI investigation, but the completeness of the VI pathway is not resolved. So for example, at your site, let's say there's soil gas, you have, let's say you start with groundwater, you've got groundwater contamination, you have soil gas that exceeds the soil gas screening levels for the site-related contaminants of concern. However, this is an active site and your same contaminants of concern are either stored, used, or handled in those site operations. So here, the investigator would not collect indoor air samples because it's not really possible to distinguish between the potential background contamination versus any kind of vapor intrusion impacts. So for example, an active fuel station or an active dry cleaner, those would be examples where IVIP status would be applied. So again, this is under the assumption that these are still actively working fuel stations, actively working and functioning dry cleaners, and those particular contaminants of concern are still used in the storage, in the handling, operations, the storage use within that particular site and at that particular building, right? So oftentimes we see situations where indoor air is collected at a particular site, like the ones I just mentioned, and then there's an exceedance, and then the LSRP wants to make the claim for IVIP status or that it is background contamination and therefore no further investigation were done. And that's not how IVIP works. IVIP, you just defer the indoor air sampling until that particular status no longer applies for that building. And also a clarification here is that IVIP status does not apply to adjacent buildings or leaseholds. We'll touch upon that a little bit more in the next slide. To clarify as well, the IVIP status does require a variance from the requirement to complete the RI and must be documented in key document submissions and remedial action permits. So that's really important. That's why it's bolded. Oftentimes we see IVIP, but then there's no variance attached to it, and that's going to get flagged for an incomplete sort of submission. So there's no specific form for IVIP identification, so it really is memorialized in these particular documents. So all applicable forms and permit applications have been modified to include the pertinent information for the IVIP status. And there's boilerplate language in the VIT for what to include in these submissions. And always, 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 as Lynn mentioned before, provide the technical justification, provide your multiple lines of evidence, provide your data for why IVIP status is appropriate for your site. Next slide, please. So the ever popular New Jersey strip mall scenario, we all know them and we all shop at them, we all love them. It's typically a dry cleaner and a pizza place and maybe a nail salon, maybe a party store or something like that. But we always have this dry cleaner issue in strip malls in New Jersey. So the dry cleaner in the strip mall scenario. So to be clear, neighboring leaseholds are not subject to OSHA PELs or IVIP status if there is an issue with that dry cleaner. Those neighboring leaseholds must be compliant with the applicable screening levels and remediation standards. So again, a gift shop next to a dry cleaner is not subject to the same criteria as the dry cleaner because they, for example, share an HVAC system or they share the same drop ceiling. Those neighboring leaseholds must be compliant with the applicable screening levels and remediation standards. If they are not, then some form of interim measure must be taken to reduce the levels in the neighboring leaseholds. Another issue that we see is the number of subslab soil gas and indoor air samples collected, which may not be appropriate for the type of building. So subslab sampling requirements can't be based on area of the building alone. The determination of the necessary number of samples to characterize the impacts to a building from VI are really going to vary from building to building, depending on various features and use of the building. So for example, a 15,000 square foot strip mall separated into 5 leaseholds and tenant spaces with maybe questionable foundation integrity. Maybe there's a daycare in that strip mall or a mommy and me type of situation or a dance studio, something like that. So a building like that might require up to 15 soil gas samples, where a standalone 25,000 square foot building that's mostly warehouse and it's got one single subslab that's in decent shape might only require 6, 10, 12 samples. So all this information should inform the investigator on the most appropriate sampling approach and the appropriate number of samples. So, to reiterate, at the end of the day, it's really up to the LSRP to ensure the most conservative approach is used to protect those receptors, and that is via the proper number of sampling. Next slide, please. Another issue that's been coming up a little bit more frequently lately is the long-term monitoring being terminated without the proper post-mitigation sampling. So Section 652 of the VIT discusses long-term monitoring plans in greater detail. And also the remedial action permitting folks refer to Table 6-2 that you see here as a guideline when evaluating your long-term monitoring plans. That might be part of your biennial certs or your RAP applications, what have you. So to be clear, monitoring can be altered based on professional judgment if it's still considered protective and technically supported with multiple lines of evidence. Examples of that can include decreasing the indoor air sampling after 5 years because there are long-term trends available and groundwater concentrations are significantly decreasing. So that's, you've got some latitude there with your professional judgment. However, the department approval to terminate a long-term monitoring plan is required, and it has to include those 3 bullets there. So you need the 2 rounds of compliant soil gas and indoor air samples, which should be taken 4 months apart, and at least one of those sampling events has to be in the heating season. So you can't just stop the long-term monitoring plan without informing the department and without those 2 clean rounds. And this is required per the tech regs. It's 5.2 of the tech regs. So if you need to visit that, I would suggest doing that. So again, you have to have those 3 things in place in order to terminate your long-term monitoring plan. Next slide, please. These are just some general clarifications. We do get a very wide range of technical and administrative questions and issues with respect to the VI exposure pathway, and we certainly don't have time to cover all of them. But some of these are the more frequently asked questions that do come up. So the tech regs require the analysis of all VI samples for the compounds listed in Table 1 of the NJDEP method LLTO 15. After that, the subsequent sampling events may have a reduced panel of contaminants. However, that first one has to have all of them. So make sure you are using a certified lab and make sure that the method that you are using analyzes for those contaminants of concern. The next bullet there says access issues, and this is something that we really often see, and I know it can be challenging. I did do some community relations work before I'm serving in my current role now, so I understand that access issues can be frustrating. However, it is the investigator's responsibility to gain access to those properties in order to conduct the investigation. So not going far enough and choosing not to obtain access to a building does not support a variance for completing a receptor evaluation. And really the law is on your side, and as much as we don't want to have to use it, it is there if you do need to. The third bullet there is the indoor air building survey. Now this is a really great tool that I can't stress enough the importance of submitting this with your VI investigation information. So thoroughly documenting info in your indoor air building survey and submitting it as a part of your multiple lines of evidence approach. So the department will not really agree with your claim for background contamination if a detailed building survey is not included with your submission. So we see this all the time where they're trying to write off benzene, for example, and then they state that, well, we took the sample next to the garage. Well, again, if you included that information in your building survey, it would be a lot less tedious for the department and you to have the back and forth to try to argue this away. So just do that building survey, submit it, be as detailed and explicit as possible. The next bullet is with respect to receiving non-detect results where analytical reporting limits exceed the screening level or remediation standard. The department does not accept an ND result for this situation. We know that oftentimes dilutions from the laboratory cause issues like this. However, an ND result is not going to be accepted if the reporting limit exceeds the screening levels or remediation standards. The fifth bullet, just again, I get this question probably once or twice a week. Yes, paper copies are still required to be submitted. Electronic copies, if you have them, are certainly appreciated to accompany those. However, at present, paper copies are still required. They are working on getting it where it's just electronic, but just be patient. Hopefully they'll have that shored up soon enough. But if you have those electronic copies, I know that the data validation folks certainly appreciate it. And that should cover it. Next slide, please. My name again is Nicole. VI investigation and mitigation is what I do. If you have any specific questions with respect to alternative remediation standards or the vapor intrusion screening level or indoor air remediation standard development, Erica Snyder is your SRP contact for that. And my wonderful colleague, Diane Gard, who just spoke, she is the receptor evaluation guru if you have any questions with respect to that. So, feel free to reach out at any point. Sometimes it's just easier to have a conversation than going back and forth via email or if you're not clear on what you need to submit. So please feel free to reach out to us. And that's all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Thanks, Nicole. That was great.
Okay, thank you to Nicole and Diane and Jillian for putting this together. We appreciate your time and efforts. And any questions you have after the fact, please reach out directly to these DEP reps. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks. Take care.